Hi, everyone. Quick one for you. Make sure you subscribe and like before we start. Thank you. I sit in my office staring out of the window at the dull city skyline. The day is gray, fitting for the stage I've set. Each piece of the puzzle is in place, every element of my plan perfectly aligned. It's taken months, no years to reach this point. But I'm patient. I've always been patient. She has no idea, of course. Melissa, in her endless web of lies and deceit, is living life as though she's untouchable. It's almost funny in a way how she continues her charade, thinking she's still pulling the wool over my eyes. Her perfect little world is about to implode, and she won't even see it coming until the last second. I glance at my phone, a few emails, some minor tasks for work. I've kept everything normal, blending into my daily routine as though nothing has changed. But inside, everything is different. Inside, I'm not the man I was before. She made sure of that the day she decided her perfect life needed something more, something I couldn't give her. And now she'll pay for that decision. It wasn't just about the affair. I wish it were that simple. An affair is common, predictable even. No, what bothers me is how she crafted her lie, how she used me. I think back to all the times she'd come home late, the moments she'd look me in the eye and tell me she loved me, all while sneaking behind my back. That's what stung. Not the betrayal of the body, but the audacity of her thinking I'd never notice, that I was too blind or too trusting to figure it out. I had to be smarter than her. She made it easy, though, underestimating me the way she did. That's what gave me the upper hand, the arrogance, the entitlement she carried around like a badge of honor. In her mind, she's the star of her own tragic romance, where I'm the clueless fool providing the backdrop for her adventure. Well, the fool's playing a new role now. I've planted seeds carefully. It started small, subtle shifts in conversations, nudging people in her office to doubt her reliability. A few misplaced documents, a strategic misunderstanding here and there. Nothing traceable, nothing that could lead back to me, her friends too. They're starting to notice things, to question her stories. I hear the murmurs, the slight pauses in conversations when I enter the room. I'm still the doting husband, of course. Still the man who wouldn't hurt a fly. But underneath, I'm pulling every string. She's oblivious. In her mind, everything's still intact. She hasn't yet seen the cracks, though they're beginning to show. Soon enough she will. And by then, it'll be too late. I think back to how I discovered it all. A single message, hidden in plain sight, caught my eye one night as she sat next to me, her head buried in her phone, a casual smile on her face, completely at ease. I didn't confront her, though. What would be the point? She would have lied as easily as she breathes. So I watched. I waited. From there, it was a matter of collecting data, watching patterns. Her lover, some fool with a gym membership and an inflated sense of his own importance, was predictable. Their meetups followed a schedule. It was almost laughable how little effort she put into hiding it. I suppose she never thought I'd dig this deep, or maybe she thought I wouldn't care. I cared, and now the final phase is in motion. Today she'll get the first taste of what I've been building. Her office will be buzzing with whispers by lunchtime. A few carefully placed emails, sent anonymously, will spark the fire. A colleague will question her, plant the seed of doubt about her integrity. It's small, insignificant on its own, but the first drop of water can lead to a flood. I've also taken steps socially. One of her closest friends, well, not for long, has started to receive anonymous messages. Just a few pictures, nothing overt, but enough to raise suspicion. Melissa doesn't know it yet, but her circle is closing in on her. The walls are getting tighter, and soon she'll be gasping for air. This is just the beginning. I take no joy in it, but I don't regret it either. She played her hand, and now I'm playing mine. The difference is, I've thought my moves through, every one of them. She has no idea how far I'm willing to go, not yet, but she'll find out soon enough. It started slowly, almost imperceptibly. The first signs were so subtle that I ignored them at first, excusing away her behavior as a result of work stress or fatigue. I had no reason to believe Melissa would stray. Our life from the outside seemed stable enough. But beneath the surface, I sensed something, a shift. The way she began to retreat from me, a little more each day, was like watching a familiar room fall out of focus. At first, it was the little things. She began coming home later than usual, always with a reasonable explanation. Meetings ran long, traffic, or some last-minute errand she had to run. I wanted to believe her. I convinced myself that I was being paranoid, reading too much into these small changes. But doubt has a way of creeping into your mind, setting up camp, and refusing to leave until it gnaws away at your certainty. I remember the first night it really struck me. She'd been gone later than expected, and when she returned, her face was flushed, her hair slightly tousled. She brushed past me, a quick peck on the cheek, an apologetic smile. She smelled of perfume, too much of it. That wasn't her style. Melissa never overdid it with things like that. Something was off, but again, I buried the thought. I didn't want to be that husband, the one who suspects his wife of things simply because she's late for dinner. I didn't want to didn't want to be suspicious, but the signs kept coming one after another. She started keeping her phone close to her, always within reach. I couldn't remember the last time she'd been so protective of it. When it buzzed late at night, she'd glance at the screen and immediately swipe it away, brushing it off as a work email or a message from a friend. I started to pay closer attention. When she thought I wasn't looking, I noticed her texting in quick, secretive bursts. She'd smile at her phone, then quickly return it to her purse, as though it were some guilty pleasure she was ashamed of. That smile was what finally started to break down the wall I'd built around my doubts. She didn't smile like that at me anymore. I needed proof, something to confirm what my gut was screaming at me. But I didn't confront her. Not yet. Confrontation would have been messy, emotional. It would have led to denials, tears, excuses. I didn't want her to lie to my face. I wasn't ready to hear it. So I waited. One night, when she was in the shower, I picked up her phone. My hands were steady, though I half expected them to shake. I swiped open the screen and scrolled through her messages, my heart pounding as I told myself I might not find anything at all. And then I did. It was there, in plain sight, hidden in a thread labeled innocuously with a woman's name. My pulse raced as I tapped it open, expecting to see the usual benign chatter, but the words hit me like a punch to the gut. There was no room for interpretation. The conversation was flirtatious, suggestive, filled with inside jokes and little details that no friendship would ever carry. She mentioned things I had no idea she did, activities she'd never brought up to me, and there it was, a plan for their next rendezvous, clear as day. I didn't react. I didn't break anything, didn't scream or throw the phone across the room. Instead, I carefully set it back on the table, exactly where I'd found it. I sat in the silence, my heart thudding against my ribs, as the truth settled in like a cold weight in my chest. In that moment, a million thoughts ran through my mind. I could have stormed into the bathroom, confronted her, demanded answers. I could have shown her the messages and watched her fumble through explanations. But what would that have accomplished? An emotional outburst would give her the upper hand, give her the opportunity to spin her web of lies even tighter. No, I needed to be smarter than that, smarter than her. I decided then that I would not confront her, not directly. There was no satisfaction in that. What I wanted, what I needed, was to make her feel what I was feeling. Betrayal was a slow poison, and I would let her drink from the same cup she'd poured for me. The next day, I acted like nothing had changed. I made her coffee in the morning, kissed her goodbye as she left for work. She smiled, that same smile that had once been mine, and I returned it, hiding the truth behind my eyes. As she walked out the door, I began to lay the groundwork for my plan. It wasn't enough to simply confront her or to leave her. That would have been too easy, too clean. No, I wanted to dismantle her life piece by piece, as meticulously as she had dismantled our marriage. If she thought she could walk away unscathed, she was wrong. First, I gathered information. I began tracking her movements, piecing together her lies. I followed her on the nights she claimed to be working late, watching from a distance as she met her lover at bars, restaurants, even in broad daylight. The arrogance of it, The way she paraded around as though she were untouchable fueled my determination. I hired a private investigator, someone discreet, to gather evidence I couldn't obtain on my own. Photos, emails, records of their meetings, everything I needed to build an airtight case. I wanted no room for her to weasel her way out when the time came for me to expose her. But even as I collected proof, I didn't rush to use it. Timing was everything. Revenge, to be effective, had to be slow, deliberate. I wanted her to feel secure in her lies, to continue believing she'd fooled me. The more she believed she was getting away with it, the more satisfying it would be when I finally ripped her world apart. While I gathered evidence, I began setting small traps. I didn't need to destroy her life all at once. I wanted it to unravel slowly. At her work, I subtly interfered, planting doubts in her colleagues' minds about her reliability. I started small, scheduling meetings she couldn't attend, sending misleading emails that made her look careless. It wasn't enough to get her fired, not yet, but enough to create cracks in her professional facade. Socially, I played the long game. I began whispering to her friends, planting seeds of suspicion about her integrity. Nothing overt, just a few offhand comments, letting them draw their own conclusions. People are naturally curious, and once they sensed something wasn't right, they did the rest of the work for me. Through it all, I remained the loving husband, the picture of stability. I smiled when she smiled, laughed when she laughed, all the while knowing that the foundation beneath her was crumbling. She had no idea what was happening, and that's what made it so perfect. It was only a matter of time now. Melissa still didn't have a clue. It was fascinating how much people reveal about themselves through their ignorance. For someone who believed she was so clever, so adept at hiding things, she was completely oblivious to the fact that her life was slipping away, little by little, through her fingers. I had grown accustomed to seeing the signs, tracking the slow erosion of her professional and personal worlds, and knowing that it was all my doing. But she continued as if everything was fine, as if her secret life was safe. I stayed outwardly supportive, never letting my true emotions surface. I played the loving husband, the one she could still rely on when her carefully constructed persona began to fray. When she had a bad day at work, I was there to listen sympathetically, nodding along to her complaints about backstabbing colleagues. I knew, of course, that the cracks in her work relationships weren't some random occurrence. No, they were carefully engineered setbacks I had put into motion weeks earlier. Still, I let her believe that I was her safe place. It amused me how easily she trusted me despite everything. Her career was the first target. The architecture firm where she worked was a competitive environment, full of people vying for the next promotion or high-profile project. I knew if I nudged the right people, her reputation could be eroded without her even realizing what was happening. It began subtly, an email she had sent to a client, slightly altered by me before being forwarded to her boss. The result? A missed deadline and an unhappy client. Melissa was called into a meeting and reprimanded. She came home fuming, ranting about office politics and how someone must have sabotaged her work. I smiled and told her she was probably right. She never suspected me. Then came the whispers. I made sure to plant rumors among her colleagues, offhand comments about her reliability, her commitment to the firm. I connected with a few of her coworkers at social events, cultivating a rapport that allowed me to subtly undermine her. I knew how competitive the firm was, and in that environment, doubt was all it took. Soon enough, her superiors began to question her dedication. It was only a matter of time before her responsibilities started to slip away, and I savored each little victory. She didn't realize it yet, but the professional world she had spent years building was beginning to collapse. Socially, I played the same game. We shared a circle of friends, many of whom had known us as a couple for years. I started small, hinting at certain troubles we were having, but in a way that made it seem like I was worried about her rather than angry. It was all about planting seeds, watching them take root. I mentioned her work stress, suggested that she had been distant lately, and confided that I feared she might be unhappy in our marriage. These conversations were always carefully crafted to make it seem like I was the supportive husband trying to understand his wife's struggles. In truth, I was slowly isolating her from the people she trusted most. The beauty of it was that I never had to say anything overt. I let them form their own conclusions. People are naturally curious, and with the right amount of doubt in their minds, they started to notice things on their own. Melissa had always been the type to dominate conversations, to control the narrative in our group, but as my quiet whispers took effect, her friends began to pull away. They became colder, more distant. I could see her confusion, how she didn't understand why people were acting differently toward her. It was perfect. She was losing her grip, and she didn't even know it. There was a particular satisfaction in watching it unfold. Her lover, the one she had chosen over me, had no idea what was happening either. He was a distraction for her, someone to escape to when things got tough. But I was patient. I didn't confront him, didn't let on that I knew. I wanted to keep him in play for as long as possible, to give her the false sense of security that her affair was still hidden. He too would play a role in her eventual downfall, though neither of them could see it coming. In the meantime, I had continued to gather more evidence, carefully documenting every lie, every betrayal. I hired the private investigator again, this time to dig deeper into her lover's life. The more I knew about him, the better I could use him to further unravel her world. He wasn't anything special, a mediocre man with an inflated sense of self-worth, much like Melissa had become. I found out about his financial troubles, his string of failed relationships, and how he had lied to Melissa about his own situation. It was all useful, ammunition I could use when the time came to expose everything. The emotional distance between us was growing, though I doubt she noticed it. While I played the part of the supportive husband, inside I had long since disconnected. The love I had once felt for her was gone, replaced by a cold, calculated focus. My life had become about strategy, how best to undermine her, how to ensure that every part of her life fell apart in just the right sequence. It was a strange feeling, living with someone while actively plotting their destruction, but I had become so accustomed to it that it felt almost normal. There were moments, though, when I could see the weight of her choices starting to bear down on her. She would sit in silence more often, staring into space as if trying to make sense of the shifts in her life. I could tell she felt it, her career slipping away, her friends growing distant, but she didn't have the clarity to connect the dots yet, not fully. That was the key. I wanted her to feel like something was wrong without being able to pinpoint what it was. I wanted her to experience the confusion, the frustration, the slow unraveling of everything she had worked for, just as I had when I first discovered her betrayal. The next phase was the tipping point, the moment when everything I had set in motion would begin to accelerate. I made sure to time it perfectly. Her reputation at work was already fragile, and I knew just the right push would send it tumbling down. I had intercepted another email, this time one she had sent to a client, making promises she couldn't possibly keep. It wasn't hard to alter it just enough to make her look incompetent. When the client inevitably complained, it was a disaster. Her boss called her into a meeting, this time with HR present. I knew it wasn't going to end well for her. She came home that night looking exhausted, her usual confidence replaced by a weary uncertainty. She didn't say much during dinner, barely touched her food. I didn't press. I didn't need to. The satisfaction of knowing what was coming was enough for me. A few days later, she was formally demoted, her responsibilities reduced, her authority stripped away. She tried to put on a brave face, telling me that it was just a temporary setback, that she would bounce back soon. I nodded and told her I believed in her, but we both knew it wasn't true. Meanwhile, socially, the isolation I had engineered was starting to take effect. Friends stopped calling, stopped inviting us to gatherings. When we did see them, there was a noticeable shift in the way they interacted with her. Conversations became shorter, more distant. Melissa tried to brush it off, blaming it on everyone being busy with their own lives. But I knew better. The whispers I had planted months ago were bearing fruit. The doubts her friends had about her, about our marriage, had grown into something far more substantial. She was no longer the confident, outgoing woman who commanded attention in every room. She was shrinking little by little, and I reveled in it. The final move came sooner than I had anticipated. Her lover, so smug, so sure of himself, had started to pull away. I had made sure to feed him just enough doubt about Melissa's loyalty, a few well-timed messages, carefully disguised as if they had come from someone close to her, were all it took. He began to question her commitment to him, wondering if she had been seeing someone else behind his back. It was laughable, really, considering their entire relationship was built on lies. But it was exactly the push I needed to drive a wedge between them. When he broke things off with her, it was brutal. He didn't sugarcoat it. He accused her of using him, of lying to him the way she had lied to me. She came home that night in tears, her entire demeanor shattered. For the first time in months, she asked me if we could talk. She wanted to explain, to confess, as if that would somehow make it all better. I listened, letting her spill out her version of the truth, but inside I was miles away, already planning the next move. I didn't forgive her. I didn't offer her any comfort. I told her that I needed time to process everything, that we could talk about it later. But the truth was, I had already moved on from her emotionally. My plan was almost complete, and she was standing on the edge of a cliff without even knowing it. All that was left was the final push. The next day, I made my decisive move. I leaked the affair to the people who mattered most: her boss, her closest friends, even a few family members. The fallout was immediate. She was called into another meeting at work, this time with no hope of saving her position. Her friends turned on her, the ones who hadn't already distanced themselves. Even her family, the ones who had always supported her, began to question her. She was completely alone, just as I had intended. Watching her world collapse around her was more satisfying than I had imagined. But the strangest part was that, in the end, I didn't feel triumphant. I had won, but it wasn't the victory I had envisioned. As I watched her unravel, a part of me wondered if it had been worth it. Revenge, I realized, had its cost, and now we were both paying it. There was a time when I thought I'd never get over the betrayal, that it would break me in ways I couldn't recover from. I was wrong. Looking back now, I realize it wasn't just the affair itself that left the deepest cut. It was the lie I'd been living in for years, the false sense of security, the belief that the woman I'd built my life with was someone she never really was. That, more than anything, was the source of my pain. But pain is a funny thing. It morphs, reshapes itself, and when channeled correctly, it becomes a weapon. I remember sitting in the darkness of our bedroom the night I made my decision. Melissa was out with her lover, and I was left alone, my thoughts spiraling through memories that no longer felt real. It was like watching the film of my life from a distance, knowing that the plot had already unraveled, but unable to turn it off. The betrayal had altered everything: who I was, what we were, and as I sat there, I realized I had two choices: let this ruin me or take control. I chose control. In the weeks that followed, I made myself focus on what needed to be done. Emotions could come later, after the plan had been executed. I methodically gathered every piece of evidence I needed, documenting her lies, her meetings with him, and the way she'd manipulated our life together to serve her selfish needs. I had already set the wheels in motion at work, and now it was time to take it further. The beauty of it all was in the subtlety. I didn't need a grand confrontation, no dramatic explosion that would alert her to my intentions. What I needed was for her to feel like the ground was crumbling beneath her feet, but never be quite sure why. That was the real power in my approach, the slow erosion of her life. The way her career, her friendships, her lover, all began to slip away from her, one agonizing piece at a time. But as I've come to learn, revenge is as much about psychology as it is about action. It's not just about what you do, it's about how you make your target feel. For Melissa, I wanted her to experience the same doubt, confusion, and loss of control that I had felt when I first discovered the affair. I wanted her to question everything, to slowly unravel under the pressure of not knowing where the attacks were coming from. And in that sense, I succeeded. It was fascinating to watch. Every time something went wrong at her job, I saw the flash of uncertainty in her eyes. She was losing her grip, her confidence shaken. At home, the tension grew thick between us, though I maintained the facade of a supportive husband. But I could feel it, the growing distance, the way she was slowly retreating into herself, not yet able to connect the dots, but sensing that something was terribly wrong. In social circles, I watched as her friends began to drift away, their trust in her shaken by the rumors I'd carefully planted. I knew it was only a matter of time before she'd notice the subtle shifts, the coldness in the way they spoke to her, the way invitations to gatherings became less frequent. Melissa, so used to being the center of attention, was now an outsider in her own life. Her lover was the final piece. He was always the weakest link, a man driven by his ego and lust rather than any genuine feelings for her. I had gathered enough dirt on him to ruin him if necessary, but I didn't need to go that far. Instead, I played the long game, feeding him just enough doubt to make him question whether Melissa was truly loyal to him. It didn't take much, just a few well-placed comments, a fabricated story about her seeing someone else on the side. His insecurities did the rest. When he finally broke things off with her, it was brutal. I had hoped to be there when it happened, to see the look on her face when her world crumbled, but I didn't need to be. She came home that night and the devastation was written all over her. She didn't say a word. For the first time in months, Melissa looked like a woman who had lost everything. And in that moment, I felt a surge of satisfaction I hadn't anticipated. But satisfaction is fleeting. As I watched her unravel, a part of me expected to feel more triumphant, to relish the downfall I had orchestrated. Yet as the days passed, I found myself feeling something I hadn't planned for: emptiness. The revenge, as satisfying as it was in the moment, didn't bring the closure I thought it would. Melissa was a shell of herself now, her career in shambles, her friends gone, her lover having abandoned her. But where did that leave me? The truth was, I had become someone different in the process. Revenge had changed me, hardened me in ways I hadn't fully understood until now. I thought back to the man I had been before all of this began, the man who loved his wife, who believed in her, who would have done anything to protect the life they had built together. That man no longer existed. And yet, the pain still lingered. Despite all I had done, all I had taken from her, it hadn't healed the wound. If anything, it had deepened it. I had spent so long focusing on tearing her down that I hadn't considered what I would do once it was over. One night, weeks after her lover had left, Melissa came to me, broken and desperate. She confessed everything as though it could somehow make things right. She begged for forgiveness, told me that she had made a mistake, that she loved me, that she wanted to rebuild what we had. But as he listened to her, I realized that her words held no power over me anymore. The woman standing before me was a stranger, and there was no going back to what we had once been. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "I know I don't deserve another chance, but I'm begging you. Please, let's try to fix this." I looked at her for a long time, trying to find the remnants of the woman I had once loved. But all I saw was the wreckage of her decisions, the consequences of her actions. She had destroyed us long before I had begun to destroy her. "Melissa," I said quietly, "there's nothing left to fix." She broke down in front of me, sobbing into her hands. And for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her, but only for a moment. This was the path she had chosen, and now she had to live with it. I turned and walked away, leaving her to face the ruin she had made of her life. I didn't need to stay and watch anymore. The final blow had already been delivered, and there was nothing left for me to do. In the weeks that followed, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. The revenge had been carefully planned, executed with precision, and yet it had left me feeling hollow. I had won, but the victory was bittersweet. In destroying her, I had also destroyed something within myself. I thought about leaving, about walking away from everything we had shared and starting over somewhere new. But a part of me knew that no matter where I went, the scars of what had happened would follow me. You don't just walk away from betrayal. It lingers, seeps into the cracks of who you are, and no amount of distance can erase that. Revenge had given me control, but it hadn't brought the peace I had hoped for. It was a lesson I hadn't expected to learn, that even in victory, there can be a kind of defeat. The life I had before was gone, and no amount of retribution could bring it back. I began to realize that the real battle wasn't with Melissa, but with myself. I had spent so much time and energy plotting her downfall that I hadn't considered what it would cost me. And now, standing in the wreckage of our lives, I had to confront the reality that I was no longer the man I had been. I wasn't sure where to go from here. The revenge was over, but the aftermath was just beginning. Melissa would have to pick up the pieces of her shattered life, and I would have to figure out what came next. Because while I had taken control of the situation, I had also lost something vital along the way, something I wasn't sure I could ever get back. In the end, revenge doesn't heal. It doesn't erase the betrayal or bring closure. It shifts the pain, redistributes it, but the wound remains. And now I was left to face the consequences of my actions, just as Melissa had to face hers. It was over, but I wasn't free. Not yet. I thought I had prepared myself for everything. Every step of my plan had been so carefully crafted, each piece fitting into the next like an intricate puzzle, slowly assembling her downfall. Melissa's life was in freefall, her job on the brink of collapse, her social circle disintegrating, her affair exposed. But as I watched her unravel, it became clear that I hadn't prepared myself for one crucial element: my own emotions. In the days after her lover left her, Melissa was a wreck. I watched her break down in ways I hadn't anticipated. She didn't just cry, she seemed to lose herself entirely. The confident, self-assured woman I had married was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized. She stopped leaving the house unless absolutely necessary, and even then she did so with her head down, as if trying to make herself invisible. She was ashamed, humiliated, and defeated. I'd expected this. In fact, I had counted on it. But what I hadn't anticipated was how watching her fall apart would affect me. I'd spent so long detaching myself from her, treating her like an object of my vengeance, that I'd forgotten she was still human. And as she crumbled, part of me began to feel something. Was it regret? Pity? I wasn't sure, but I knew it wasn't what I had planned for. Every time I saw her retreat into herself, isolating in our once shared home, I felt a strange pull. I'd watch her sit at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the wall, her hands clasped around a cold cup of coffee. She would sigh, and in that breath, there was a weight that I couldn't ignore. I told myself that she deserved this, that everything she was going through was a result of her own choices. But still, the feeling gnawed at me. Despite everything, I continued with my plan. Her unraveling was far from complete. I moved to the next phase, tightening the noose around her professional life. Melissa had managed to hold on to her position at work by the skin of her teeth, but that wouldn't last much longer. I had made sure of it. The final blow was simple, really. It was nothing more than a cleverly doctored email, forwarded to the right person at the right time. The contents of that email were damning: financial mismanagement, conversations with clients that made her seem careless, and mistakes she had supposedly made. When her boss called her in for a meeting, she looked as though she already knew what was coming. Melissa had been walking on eggshells at work for weeks, and this was the culmination of every seed of doubt I had planted. She didn't come home that night until late, and when she finally walked through the door, she didn't say a word. Her face was pale, her eyes vacant. I didn't need to ask. I already knew she had been fired. Watching her sit down on the couch, her shoulders slumped in defeat, I realized that my plan had worked. Her career was over. The thing she had worked so hard to build, the thing that had given her purpose, was gone. And yet, as I stood there, waiting for the rush of satisfaction that should have followed, I felt nothing, just an emptiness that settled in the pit of my stomach. I left her there on the couch and went to bed, listening as she quietly cried in the living room. I should have felt victorious, but all I felt was hollow. The weight of everything I had done was starting to press down on me in ways I hadn't expected. I had won, yes, but at what cost? In the days that followed, Melissa barely left the house. She was a ghost of her former self, moving through the motions of life with no sense of direction. Her friends had abandoned her lover was long gone, and now her career had slipped through her fingers. I had taken everything from her. And still, I couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't right. I began to realize that in destroying her, I had also destroyed a part of myself. The man I had once been, the man who loved her, who cared about building a life together, was gone. I had become someone else, someone colder, more calculating. And while I had told myself that this transformation was necessary, that it was the only way to survive her betrayal, I was beginning to wonder if I had gone too far. Melissa was starting to catch on, though. She wasn't stupid. For weeks, she had been confused, wondering why everything around her was crumbling. But now, in her moments of quiet reflection, she was beginning to piece things together. I could see it in the way she looked at me, her eyes narrowing slightly, a flicker of understanding crossing her face when she thought I wasn't paying attention. I had anticipated this. I knew she would eventually start to suspect something, and I was prepared. But still, it was unsettling to see the gears turning in her mind. She hadn't confronted me yet, but it was only a matter of time. And then one night it happened. I was sitting in the kitchen, going over some work emails when she appeared in the doorway. Her eyes were red, her face pale, but there was a quiet intensity about her that I hadn't seen in weeks. "Did you do this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't look up from my laptop. "Do what?" "All of it," she said, stepping further into the room. "Everything that's happened. My job, my friends, all of it." "Was it you?" I kept my face blank, my tone even. "I don't know what you're talking about." She stood there for a long moment, staring at me, as if trying to figure out whether I was lying. But I could see the doubt in her eyes, the way her resolve wavered. She didn't have proof, not yet. After a few seconds, she shook her head, as if trying to shake the thought away. I don't know what's happening anymore," she said softly. "It's like everything is falling apart, and I don't know why." I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. She left the room, and I heard the soft click of the bedroom door closing behind her. I sat there for a long time after that, staring at my laptop screen, but not really seeing anything. Her words echoed in my mind, and for the first time since all of this had started, I felt something close to guilt. But guilt was a useless emotion. It wouldn't change anything. I had made my choices, and now I had to live with them. Over the next few weeks, Melissa's suspicion grew. She didn't say anything outright, but I could feel it in the way she moved around me, the way she watched me when she thought I wasn't paying attention. I knew it wouldn't be long before she confronted me again, and this time, she wouldn't be as easily deterred. In the meantime, I continued with the final stages of my plan. There was one more move to make, one more piece to put into place before it was all over. I leaked the information about her affair to the right people. It wasn't difficult. A few anonymous messages, a couple of well-placed hints, and soon her reputation was in tatters. Her family found out first. Her parents, who had always been so proud of her, so sure that she was the perfect daughter. The news hit them hard, and the fallout was immediate. Melissa tried to deny it at first, but the evidence was overwhelming. There was no escaping the truth. Her family cut ties with her, and the rest of her social world followed suit. Melissa was left completely isolated, with no one to turn to. And still, she hadn't confronted me, not directly. But I knew it was coming. One evening, she finally snapped. It had been building for days. The tension between us, the way she looked at me, the questions that went unspoken. And then, as we sat in silence over dinner, she slammed her fork down onto the table and glared at me with a fury I hadn't seen in years. "You did this," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "You're behind all of it, aren't you?" I met her gaze, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over me. "What if I am?" She stared at me, her chest rising and falling as she tried to process what I had just said. "Why?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "Why would you do this to me?" I leaned back in my chair, my eyes never leaving hers. Because you deserved it. Her face crumpled, and for a moment I thought she might start crying. But instead, she stood up from the table and walked away, leaving me sitting there in the dim light of the dining room, alone with the wreckage of everything we had once been. The final blow had been struck. In the days that followed, Melissa didn't speak to me. We lived like strangers in the same house, passing each other in silence, neither of us willing to acknowledge the truth that hung between us. And then, one morning, she was gone. I woke up to an empty house, her clothes missing from the closet, her car gone from the driveway. There was no note, no goodbye, just silence. As I stood in the doorway of our empty bedroom, I realized that this was the end. I had won, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like the closing of a chapter I hadn't wanted to finish. And as I sat down on the edge of the bed, the weight of everything finally hit me. I remember the exact moment it happened. I hadn't even meant to be there. I was supposed to be out of town for a work trip, but a last-minute change of plans brought me home early. It was late, past midnight, when I walked into the house. The lights were dim, and the only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioner. I felt an odd sense of disconnection as I stood in the entryway, my suitcase still clutched in my hand, the familiarity of my surroundings feeling distant, like I didn't quite belong there anymore. And then I saw them. Melissa, sitting across from him, her legs casually draped over his, their heads close together as they whispered, laughed, and touched in the way I hadn't seen her touch me in years. My heart didn't stop. It didn't even race. Instead, I felt the strangest sense of calm settle over me as I watched them, my mind processing the scene as if it were happening to someone else. The intimacy between them was undeniable, the kind that can only be shared by people who believe no one else exists in the world but them. I didn't move. I didn't need to. The betrayal wasn't a revelation, it was confirmation. I'd suspected it for months, felt the distance between us growing wider with every passing day. But seeing the way she leaned into him, the way her face lit up when he whispered in her ear, erased any lingering doubt I had tried to suppress. They didn't notice me at first, too wrapped up in each other, too lost in the illusion of safety they had created. But when he reached for her hand and she responded with a smile I hadn't seen in years, something shifted in me. The calm I had felt moments before hardened into something cold and unrecognizable. I cleared my throat. Melissa froze. Her eyes flicked toward me, widening in shock as she processed the fact that I was standing there, watching them. He pulled his hand away from hers, stiffening in his seat, unsure of what to do. I stood there silent, letting the weight of my presence sink in. I could see the panic spreading across her face, the quick calculation in her eyes as she tried to figure out how much I had seen, how much I knew. I wasn't expecting company, I said quietly, my voice steady, devoid of the anger or hurt she might have anticipated. I wasn't hurt, not in the way she imagined. I was beyond that now. Michael, she stammered, pushing herself off the couch, her voice shaky as she stepped toward me. I can explain. I held up a hand to stop her. No, I said, the finality in my voice cutting through the tension in the room. You don't need to explain anything. Her lover, some forgettable man I had never bothered to learn the name of, stood awkwardly, glancing between us, his face pale as if he were waiting for me to lash out, to scream, to demand answers. But I didn't. I wasn't interested in answers anymore. Leave, I said, directing my words to him. He hesitated, looking at Melissa for guidance, but she was too paralyzed to respond. He grabbed his jacket and left without another word, disappearing into the night like the mistake he was. I stood there, watching him go, the silence between us stretching out until it felt unbearable. Melissa, now alone with me, looked like she might break apart at any second, but I didn't feel sympathy, I didn't feel anything. I'm sorry, she whispered, tears forming in her eyes. I never meant for this to happen. It just happened. I didn't respond. What was there to say? Sorry wasn't enough. It never would be. That moment, seeing them together, hearing her excuses, it became the breaking point for me. It was the final confirmation that everything I had suspected was true. But more than that, it was the moment that shifted my resolve from hurt to action. I had stood there long enough, letting her make a fool of me. Now it was time for her to understand what it felt like to lose everything. As the weeks passed after that night, I began to fully implement my plan. It wasn't enough to confront her, to expose her for what she had done. That would have been too easy, too quick. I needed her to feel the same slow destruction I had felt, the same unraveling of everything she thought she had control over. It had to be methodical, deliberate, and without any trace of impulsive rage. If I had learned anything in those moments after catching her, it was that anger wasn't the solution. It was precision. I started with her social life. It wasn't difficult to nudge certain people in our circle toward doubt. Melissa had always been the dominant personality in our group, the one everyone deferred to, the one people gravitated toward. But all it took was a few well-placed rumors, a few suggestions that maybe she wasn't the person they thought she was, and the tide began to shift. I could see it happening when we attended social gatherings. People who had once been her closest friends started to pull away. Their trust in her eroded by the seeds of suspicion I had planted. Melissa, oblivious to my involvement, began to notice the change in her friends, the subtle coldness in their interactions. She blamed them, assuming they were jealous or distant for reasons she couldn't understand. But I could see the confusion in her eyes, the doubt creeping in as her carefully curated social life began to fracture. Her career came next. She had always prided herself on being successful, independent, and ambitious. But all it took was a few small manipulations, misplaced emails, minor mistakes that seemed like her own fault, and her professional reputation began to falter. She was blindsided when she was passed over for a promotion she had been certain was hers. And when her boss began questioning her competence, I saw the panic set in. Still, she never suspected me. To her, I was the supportive husband, the one who stood by her side, reassuring her that things would get better, that it was just a rough patch. She believed me because she wanted to believe that someone was still on her side. But I wasn't. Not anymore. I remember the day she finally broke. It was a Saturday morning, and she had just gotten off the phone with her boss, who had informed her that she was being demoted due to performance issues. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at her coffee, her hands trembling as she processed the news. I watched her from across the room, waiting for the moment when she would realize that everything was slipping away. "I don't understand," she whispered, more to herself than to me. "How did everything get so wrong?" I could have said something then, something to comfort her, to give her hope. But I didn't. I let the silence hang between us, the weight of her failure pressing down on her until she could barely breathe. And then, just as I had predicted, the cracks in her facade began to show. Melissa looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and fear. "Is it me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Have I done something wrong?" I met her gaze, feeling nothing but the cold satisfaction of watching her unravel. "You should have been more careful," I said, my voice even. "You should have paid attention." Her face crumpled, and for the first time since this all began, I saw genuine fear in her eyes. She didn't know the extent of what I had done, but she knew now that something wasn't right, that the life she had built was falling apart, and it wasn't a coincidence. In that moment, I knew I had won. She didn't need to know all the details. The realization that she was powerless, that everything she thought she had control over was slipping through her fingers, was enough. The revenge I had planned so carefully had come to fruition, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. But as I stood there, watching her break, I felt something unexpected. I had spent so long focused on my need for revenge, on dismantling her life piece by piece, that I hadn't considered what would come after. The emptiness that followed, the hollowness of victory. She didn't say anything else. She just sat there, staring down at her coffee, her shoulders slumped in defeat. And for the first time, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't expected. Regret. Not for what I had done. No, I had no regrets about that. She had deserved every bit of what had happened. But I regretted that it hadn't brought me the satisfaction I thought it would. It hadn't healed the wound she had caused. It hadn't made me feel whole again. In the end, I had destroyed her life. But in doing so, I had destroyed something in myself as well. The final piece of the puzzle was simple. Too simple, perhaps. After all the careful planning, the strategic moves, the slow erosion of her life, the last step felt almost anticlimactic. But that was the beauty of it. Revenge didn't need to end with an explosion. It could end with a whisper, a quiet, devastating revelation that would unravel everything with precision. I chose the moment carefully. It had to be public enough for her humiliation to sink in, but private enough for her to feel isolated when it happened. There was a work event she had to attend, one of those networking dinners where people pretended to care about each other's successes while secretly hoping for their rivals to fail. Melissa still had a shred of dignity left in that world, even after everything I had done to weaken her standing. She believed she could salvage her career, that she could claw her way back. I couldn't let that happen. I had spent months collecting evidence of her affair, enough to ruin her personally, but I didn't need to expose everything. I only needed one thing, a photograph. It was grainy, not incriminating on its own, but enough to plant doubt in the minds of those around her. The photo showed her with her lover, leaning in close, his hand on her back, her smile intimate and familiar. Anyone who saw it would question what they knew about her, what kind of woman she truly was. I timed it perfectly. During the dinner, as she made small talk with her colleagues, I arranged for the photo to be sent anonymously to the people who mattered most in her professional life. Her boss, her clients, her so-called friends. I knew their reactions would be swift, that whispers would begin to spread before she even realized what had happened. She was standing near the bar when I saw it hit. Her phone vibrated and I watched as she checked the screen, her face contorting with confusion, then panic. She quickly shoved the phone into her purse, but I could already see the ripple effect starting. People around her were checking their phones, glancing at her with thinly veiled judgment. The shift in the room was palpable, a slow turning of the tide against her. Melissa's face paled as the realization set in. She had lost. All her efforts to rebuild, to maintain some semblance of control, were undone in an instant. And as she stood there, alone in a room full of people, I saw the moment she connected the dots. Her eyes scanned the crowd, searching, frantic, and then they landed on me. I didn't move. I met her gaze, holding it steady, letting her see the truth in my expression. There was no need for words. She knew. She knew it had been me all along. The look on her face was one I would never forget. Shock, betrayal, and something else, something deeper. A realization that went beyond the destruction of her career, beyond the unraveling of her social circle. It was the moment she understood that the person she had trusted most had orchestrated her downfall with a precision she never saw coming. I watched her crumble, standing there as her world collapsed in front of her. It wasn't the dramatic breakdown I had once imagined. There were no tears, no public outbursts, just a quiet, devastating acceptance. She slipped out of the room without a word, disappearing into the night like a ghost, leaving behind the wreckage of her life. In the days that followed, the fallout was swift. Her reputation, already fragile, was completely destroyed. Her colleagues distanced themselves, clients pulled out of deals, and her career was effectively over. Melissa disappeared from the professional world, retreating into isolation as the weight of everything I had done pressed down on her. And me? I waited for the satisfaction to settle in, for the sense of victory to wash over me. I had won. I had taken everything from her, reduced her to nothing. But the victory I had been chasing for so long felt hollow now. The bitterness of betrayal still lingered, the wound still raw beneath the surface. I found myself reflecting on what it had all cost me. I had spent so much time focused on my revenge, on destroying her, that I hadn't realized how much of myself I had sacrificed in the process. I had become someone I didn't recognize, cold, calculating, and distant. The man I had been before her affair was gone, replaced by someone who had lost the ability to feel anything but anger and emptiness. As I sat in the quiet of our empty house, I wondered if it had been worth it. I had taken control of the situation, executed my plan with flawless precision, but the victory felt meaningless now. There was no joy in it, no sense of closure. I had won, but I had also lost something far greater than what Melissa had taken from me. In the end, revenge hadn't healed the wounds. It had only shifted the pain, redirected it, but the scars remained. Melissa was gone, her life in ruins, but I was left to live with the consequences of what I had done. The emptiness I had tried to fill with revenge still lingered, deeper now, more permanent. I had thought that destroying her would bring me peace, but all it had done was leave me standing in the ashes of everything we once were, everything I had once believed in. The satisfaction I had craved was fleeting, and now I was left to pick up the pieces of my own life, knowing that nothing would ever be the same. The victory was mine, but it came at a cost I hadn't anticipated. In the end, revenge didn't bring closure. It brought only emptiness, a reminder that some wounds can never truly be healed, no matter how carefully you plan, no matter how flawlessly you execute. I had won, but I had lost everything in the process.